In January of 1991, a 20-year-old college kid walked onto a PGA Tour course in Tucson and did something that almost never happens.
He won not as a professional, not as a millionaire, not as a polished product surrounded by agents, sponsors, lawyers, and carefully written statements. He won as an amateur. His name was Philip Alfred Mickelson. Back then, he was not yet the complicated public figure he would become. He was not yet the man attached to LIV Golf, Saudi money, SEC filings, gambling allegations, or carefully worded denials. He was just Phil, lefty. The smiling kid from Arizona State with a soft touch around the greens and a strange kind of fearlessness that made people lean forward when he had a club in his hands. At the Northern Telecom Open, he did not look like someone entering the darker machinery of professional sports. He looked like proof that golf could still be innocent. A young amateur beating grown professionals. A college player standing inside a world built for men who played for money and somehow leaving with the one thing money could not buy. Alvin. And because he was an amateur, he could not even take the prize money. That detail matters, because more than 3 decades later, it sounds almost too perfect. The first great Phil Mickelson story was about winning without getting paid. And then, over time, almost every story that damaged him seemed to begin with money. Not always directly, not always cleanly, not always with proof of wrongdoing. But money was there, in the background. In the arguments, in the filings, in the friendships, in the breakaway league, in the private wagers, in the questions nobody wanted to ask too loudly when the smile was still working. Phil Mickelson never lacked money. But almost every major controversy around him seemed to begin with it. For years, the public saw something else. They saw the thumbs up, the grin, the left-handed swing, the risky flop shot that floated like it had no interest in gravity. They saw the autograph sessions that lasted longer than expected. They saw the family man. They saw the rival to Tiger Woods, who somehow felt more approachable than Tiger. Tiger was controlled. Tiger was built like a weapon. Phil felt human. He missed fairways. He gambled with impossible shots. He smiled when it went wrong. And when it went right, it looked like magic. The public did not just admire him, they forgave him. That may be the most important part of the story. Phil Mickelson was not protected because he was perfect. He was protected because he was charming, because he made risk look romantic, because even when he lost in a way that felt dramatic, not cold. In 2006, at Winged Foot, he stood on the final hole of the US Open with a chance to win the one major that had always escaped him. He could have played safe. He did not. The ball went left. The hole collapsed. The dream broke. Afterward, Phil said the line that followed him for years. I am so ein Idiot. People laughed. People winced. People forgave him because it felt honest. Because it sounded like a man punishing himself before anyone else could. But that moment also revealed something deeper. Phil did not just take risks when he needed to. He took risks when the safer path was obvious. On a golf course that made him fascinating. Away from the golf course, it would become harder to explain. For a long time, nobody wanted to connect those worlds. The reckless shot and the reckless statement. The impossible recovery and the strange financial story. The public smile and the private appetite for risk. They were treated as separate things. Golf was golf. Money was money. Personality was personality. But years later, when the old stories began to return, they did not return as isolated headlines. They returned as a timeline, not as proof, as a pattern. The first crack did not look like a scandal. It looked like a complaint. In 2013, Phil Mickelson was one of the richest golfers on earth. He had won majors, he had endorsement deals, he had built a public image that most athletes would spend a lifetime trying to earn. Then he spoke about taxes. He suggested that high tax rates in California and at the federal level might force him to make drastic changes. The reaction was immediate. To many people, it sounded tone deaf. A man with enormous wealth was speaking as if he had been pushed into a corner. Phil later apologized for discussing the issue publicly, but the apology did not erase the impression. For the first time, some people heard something under the friendly voice. A resentment, a calculación. A reminder that behind the lovable lefty brand was a man very aware of money, leverage, and what he believed he was owed. Then the story moved on. That is what often happened with Phil. The moment would flare, the apology would come, the smile would return. Nobody asked again. The story disappeared, but it did not go away. In 2016, the name Phil Mickelson appeared in a Securities and Exchange Commission case involving Dean Foods stock, Billy Walters, and insider trading. The details were technical, and technical details can bury a story. What is confirmed is this: the SEC did not accuse Phil Mickelson of insider trading. That matters. He was named as a relief defendant, not as someone charged with securities fraud. But the filing said he had bought Dean Foods stock after receiving a tip from Walters, a famous sports gambler, and that Mickelson made close to $1 million in profit. According to the SEC, that money was used to repay gambling debts to Walters. Again, the legal distinction matters. Mickelson was not charged with insider trading. He agreed to return the money. But for anyone watching closely, the image changed. The public golfer and the private world had touched golf, gambling, debt, stock trades, a wealthy athlete, a professional gambler. And suddenly the old question became harder to avoid. How much risk was Phil taking when nobody was watching? The story did not destroy him. It should have raised alarms. But in the larger public imagination, Phil survived. He always survived. Because he was still Phil. Because the next beautiful shot was always coming. Because the next crowd could always cheer. Because sports fans are often willing to separate performance from pattern, as long as performance keeps giving them something to believe in. And then came 2021, the greatest comeback. At 50 years old, Phil Mickelson won the PGA Championship. He became the oldest man ever to win a major championship. It was cinematic. It was almost too clean. The crowd at Kiowa Island surrounded him like a moving wall of emotion. People wanted that story. They wanted the aging genius beating time. They wanted the old magician to have one more trick. And for a moment, the past looked irrelevant. The SEC filing, the tax controversy, the whispers about gambling, the strange private associations. All of it faded behind the image of a 50-year-old champion walking through chaos with history in his hands. That is the power of victory. It does not erase the record. It changes the lighting. But the lighting changed again in 2022. And this time, the smile was not enough. Phil Mickelson had been involved in conversations around a Saudi-backed golf league that would become LIV Golf. The issue was not just sports. It was money. It was power. It was human rights. It was the future of professional golf. And it was Phil, once again, standing near the center of a financial earthquake. When comments attributed to him by journalist Alan Shipnuck became public, the reaction was severe. According to the published account, Mickelson acknowledged Saudi Arabia's human rights record in brutal terms, but still described the breakaway league as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reshape how the PGA Tour operated. Those words landed differently than a bad golf shot. They were not charming. They were not easy to forgive. They sounded cold, transactional, strategic. Phil later apologized. He said his words had been reckless. He said he was deeply sorry for his choice of words. His side also disputed aspects of how the comments were presented, saying they were shared without his consent and taken out of context. That distinction matters. But the damage was already done. Sponsors stepped back. The PGA Tour relationship collapsed. Phil disappeared from public view for a period. When he returned, it was not as the universally beloved lefty. It was as one of the faces of LIV Golf, one of the symbols of golf civil war. For some, he was a traitor. For others, he was the man who forced the PGA Tour to change. And maybe that is why the story became so powerful. Because both sides could point to something real. It was true that the PGA Tour eventually changed parts of its model under pressure. It was also true that Phil's move came with the shadow of enormous Saudi-backed money. It was true that golfers had long complained about control, media rights, and the tour's structure. It was also true that Phil's public moral argument sounded different when placed beside years of money-related controversy. Again, no single event proved the whole pattern. But the pieces were no longer floating separately. They were beginning to align. The amateur who once won and could not accept the check had become the veteran willing to risk his reputation for a league built on checks so large they changed the sport. Years earlier, the public had loved his appetite for risk. Now, they were asking what that appetite had cost. Then came Billy Walters. In 2023, Walters released his account of his gambling life and his relationship with Phil Mickelson. The allegations were explosive. According to Walters, Mickelson had wagered enormous sums over the years, more than $1 billion in total bets. Walters also alleged that Phil once tried to place a bet connected to the Ryder Cup, an event Mickelson was playing in. These were allegations from Walters. They were not a court verdict. They were not proof of every detail. Mickelson denied betting on the Ryder Cup. He acknowledged past issues with gambling and said he had addressed them. Again, the distinction matters. There is no public court finding proving the most serious Ryder Cup allegation. But the public did not hear the Walters story in a vacuum. They heard it after the SEC filing, after the tax comments, after LIV, after years of rumors about gambling, and when a story returns too many times in different forms, it begins to feel less like a rumor and more like a question the public avoided for too long. Why did so many roads around Phil Mickelson lead back to risk? Why did so many of those risks involve money? The answer may not be guilt. The answer may be image. A powerful public image does not just make people famous. It teaches people how to interpret them. Tiger Woods was interpreted through dominance. Every mistake became part of a story about control breaking down. Phil Mickelson was interpreted through charm. Every mistake became part of a story about a lovable risk-taker being human. That difference protected him for a while. When Phil took an impossible shot, it was called creativity. When Phil said something careless, it was called Phil being Phil. When Phil lost a major through aggression, it was tragic but endearing. When money stories surfaced, they were complicated, legalistic, easy to set aside. The image absorbed the impact until it could not. By 2026, Phil Mickelson was no longer moving through golf with the same ease. He stepped away from tournaments, citing a family health matter. He missed events. His future looked uncertain. Then, new reports emerged involving the Farms Golf Club near San Diego. According to reports, allegations were made involving inappropriate physical contact with a female employee. Mickelson's side said the matter was a misunderstanding that had been cleared up. His lawyer said evidence contradicted the allegations and warned against false claims. What is confirmed publicly is limited. There has been no public court verdict establishing wrongdoing. There is no public evidence proving the allegation in full. And any responsible account must say that clearly. But documentary stories are not only built from verdicts, they are built from timelines. From the way a public figure is seen before an allegation and after it. From the way old questions return when a new headline appears. From the way people begin to rewatch the entire film of a career and notice details they once dismissed. The Farm story is not about money in the same direct way as LIV, taxes, gambling, or Dean Foods. But it arrived at the moment when Phil's public protection had already weakened. And when protection weakens, old stories become louder. The question was no longer whether Phil Mickelson had once been loved. He had, deeply. The question was how long that love had made the public look away. Look back at the first image, Tucson, 1991. A 20-year-old amateur wins on the PGA Tour. No prize money, no scandal, no lawyers, no Saudi-backed league, no sick language, no statements about reckless words, no gambling memoir. Just a young golfer smiling under the desert sun, holding a trophy he seemed too young to understand. That was the beginning. Or at least, that was the version people wanted as the beginning. A clean story. A pure story. A story where money was absent. But careers do not stay inside their first photographs. They move, they accumulate, they reveal. And with Phil Mickelson, the later chapters kept circling back to the same uncomfortable place. Not always criminal, not always proven, not always simple, but always close enough to ask the question. The tax comments showed resentment around what he kept. The SEC case showed proximity to a gambler, debt, and profit. LIV showed the willingness to trade public affection for leverage and guaranteed wealth.
The Walters allegations brought the gambling question back with numbers too large to ignore.
And the later reports forced the public to ask whether the old protective image still had any power left.
There is a temptation in stories like this to make the ending easy.
To say the hero was always false, or to say the critics were always unfair. But Phil Mickelson does not fit cleanly into either version. He really was brilliant. He really did give golf moments that felt impossible. He really did connect with fans in a way few athletes ever manage. He was not invented out of nothing. The love was real. That is what makes the unraveling heavier. Because the question is not whether the public loved a lie. The question is whether the public loved one part of a man so much that it stopped looking at the rest. For decades, Phil Mickelson won with risk. He built a career from shots that should not have worked. He became beloved because he made danger look graceful. But outside the ropes, danger does not float softly onto the green. It leaves paperwork, it leaves quotes, it leaves settlements, it leaves denials, it leaves people who say they warned you, and years later, it comes back. Not as proof, as a pattern. Maybe Phil Mickelson's first great story was the cleanest one, because it happened before the money arrived. Maybe that is why it still matters. A young amateur won a professional tournament and could not take the check. The crowd saw innocence. The sport saw a future star. And nobody knew that one day the most haunting question around Phil Mickelson would not be how much he won. It would be what he was willing to risk after he already had everything.
Maybe he never needed to explain it.
Maybe the rest of the story simply caught up to him. And maybe the first check he could not cash was the last simple thing in the whole file.